Yeah, I feel really grateful to be a part of this place. In fact, today, see, this proves that Facebook can be of some use. Um, my friend said, "Hey, Facebook reminded me that you've been here for 1 year now. So this is my 1 year sort of, yeah, celebration." That's why I brought that up. I wanted people to clap. Um, yeah, and I mean, what a gift this year has been to me, really. Um, just to be a part of this place and to meet so many of you and hear a bit of your stories and where you're coming from and how you ended up here and why you're still here. I don't know. It's a unique and special place, really, and I couldn't have engineered my contribution here. It just the universe unfolds in mysterious ways, and in this sense, I'm just really grateful to be a part of this place. And it's been a strange few weeks for me. I was in Seattle for a couple Sundays. My friend Ryan has a church out there, and I won't give you the full story, but the story is not unlike C3. Um, they were more in the evangelical world, however, and they were like a big mega church with multiple campuses and thousands of people. And then they kind of suddenly went open and affirming and were less interested in doctrine, and they whittled themselves down to about 800 people, which is still a lot. It's a lot of people gathering. It's just cool that so much of, not that that's how things should be, but it's just interesting how much religion, spirituality, and communities are changing. And and that upheaval can be difficult, and yet it also, I think, creates a certain kind of bond. And so anyway, I was out there for a couple Sundays. I did a retreat out there. We Ryan and I led a retreat together, which was a strange time to be out there, by the way, because all these fires from British Columbia were blowing into the Puget Sound, and so it was really hard to breathe for a couple days. Which is, when you go to Seattle in the summer, you want to see things. You're like, it's not raining, maybe we can see the mountains. But instead, you could barely see. On some days, you could barely see 100 yards. It's very strange. It also created this sort of dreamlike landscape from sunup to sundown. It looked like it was sunset. It was incredible. Um, so yeah, it was. I enjoyed my time out there. But then when I got back, I found out that a friend of mine, actually, the day I got back, a friend of mine passed away, which is why Matt Laidlaw was here last week. I was planning on teaching last week, but um, a friend that I've known for 25 years was just out on a bike ride and had a heart attack. And it was a blow, big time. And I felt like, no, I want to be at the funeral. He influenced me in ways that are kind of hard to describe. And really, probably I would have been unable to describe it without sort of his death. All of a sudden, I realized, whoa, so much of my ideas, my aesthetics, musically. He was a musician. He wrote all these songs. I met him in Virginia when I was in college, and he wrote all these songs in a for Christian context, like worship songs or sacred songs, I might call them, in an era when it was like Jesus is my boyfriend kind of songs, or like songs that God is really awesome, but you are really terrible. He had all this body of work that was, he just took stuff straight from the Psalms and other scripture passages, and sometimes even creeds. And he was a really good songwriter, so that helped. Um, and I don't know, I just sort of got into this music, and that really shaped so much of my life. Because when I left Virginia, moved up here, and was a part of Mars Hill, I did the music for the first 4 years, and also sometimes I did it afterwards. Basically, using all these songs that he just wrote in his little basement apartment. Sort of, I took them into a larger context. So that was just one tiny thread. Um, and what else? I mean, he, to me, bridged this kind of ancient and contemporary space. He was an Anglo-Catholic, which would, all the incense, and it's the Episcopal, it's really the conservative expression of the Episcopal Church, but they've got the incense and the mass and all this kind of stuff. And yet he also is the one that introduced me to Tom Waits. So he just was like this really eclectic, interesting person. He gave me a copy of Augustine's Confessions a long time ago, before I was really even into early Christianity and Judaism, and actually what took me to Israel for graduate school. It's just those kind of little like seeds and threads in my life. So anyway, thanks for letting me go to the funeral. I played some of his songs in the middle of this high mass too, which was really kind of he would have liked. And thanks for welcoming Matt. There's not too many. Matt is a friend of mine. We worked together at Mars Hill, and then he left Mars Hill after I did. And there were not too many people that I could call and say, hey, in 2 days, can you give like a talk? So I watched it, and I thought he did it personally. I thought he did a great job, and I felt like there was a nice reciprocal dynamic of warmth. So anyway, I appreciate you inviting him in. Maybe I'll have him back sometime. All right, what do I want to talk about today? I want to do a version of the teaching I was going to do last week, which was cosmology and creation. So you've had the same readings for 2 weeks in a row, which I think is actually awesome. Part of me just wants to keep them going because they're... this poem, which I've actually worked with before, this Diane DePrima poem called Rant. You should check it out. She's a beat poet. That's the opening line. You cannot write a single line without a cosmology. What is she talking about? You cannot write a single line without a cosmology. And I'm going to make like a macro statement here for a second. I think this is one of the big invitations of the 21st century, and if the human race survives into other centuries, the big invitation being we need a new cosmology. We need a new cosmology that is somehow rooted in our own antiquity and somehow is up to date with the world as we know it, the scientific world as we know it, facts as we know it. And of course, we live in a political environment that is suspicious of what we would call facts. But even scientists would say a fact is a somewhat relative thing. We're always on the journey for how to understand the world. So again, the macro statement is we need a new cosmology. We need a cosmology for the 21st century because the one for the 20th century and the 19th century and the 18th century has ended up depleting our rivers and killing our oceans and cutting down our mountains and destroying our forests and making it increasingly uninhabitable. So again, what is a cosmology, you might ask? And I think I want to just give you the most simple definition from the Greek. Cosmos is world. By the way, side note, I think this is always interesting. You know that sign that you see at football games, John 3:16? You know? In Greek, it says, for God so loved the cosmos, which is just such an interesting... Doesn't that sound different than for God so loved the world? For God so loved the cosmos. Wait a minute, I thought we're the only thing that matters. So anyway, that's just an aside that popped into my head. Cosmos is world, and a cosmology is the study. Logia, you might say in Greek, is the study of. So, what is a cosmology? The study of the world. And that is obviously an ongoing part of what it means to be a human being. And right now, we know much more about the world than they did 100 years ago, and 1,000 years ago, and 5,000 years ago. On a certain level, we know much more about the world and how it came to be, and the distances between things. And we know more about what's going on the micro level than we ever have before. We know so much about what's going on the micro level, we have now the capacity to destroy all of us in just a few seconds. What used to be the job of the sun, we have buttons for. Seriously. Or the stars. We have that kind of, we've harnessed, if you want to call it that, that kind of potential. So we need a new cosmology. What is this world that we're living in? And how do we live in it? And all ancient cosmologies helped human beings live a meaningful life. Otherwise, it wasn't a useful cosmology. A study of the world that gave meaning to life. And would you agree that we need some study of the world that gives life meaning? And not just meaning on the human level, like for my tribe and my ethnicity and my socioeconomic class, but meaning for all beings and all creatures. Because now more than ever, what used to be the intuition of the great spiritual traditions, the intuition was it's all connected, is actually the case. It's the case on the subatomic level. So we need a new cosmology that can begin to study like this and face such a thing. And that's part of, I think, even as I think about this year, because I want to start a new series, by the way. And if you want to hear about this new series, right afterwards, stick around. Instead of doing talk back, we're going to talk about the coming year. So stick around. If you want. If you don't care, then just whatever, go home, no problem. You'll find out anyway if you come back. So, but yeah, I'm not going to exactly tell you what we'll be doing for the next year, but in some ways it's related to a word like cosmology. What if for a full year we studied the world? We just kept coming back to it. Especially in a world that is so much of it is unraveling and there's so much confusion. We return again, just again and again to this question. Yeah, and let me just add a few details. Cosmology also tried to deal with the world as a whole, as best it could. Cosmology deals with the world as a whole. Which means in our world, it might mean science and technology and facts, but also story, literature, ethics, morality. Well, and that was also true in the ancient world. You had creation stories, you had myths, you had rites and rituals and practices. That was part of the cosmology too. It wasn't like it was written down somewhere and these 10 things created cosmology. It was the study of the whole thing. How do we raise our kids? How do we bury people? What happens when a kid, something funky happens around the age of 13? I don't know what exactly it is. So we better have some rites and rituals around that to make sense of it. This is part of cosmology. And it's part of the task of, if there's such a thing as a contemporary cosmology, to keep in mind as much as possible. And by the way, elders are a part of that. Tell us what it was like to be you when you were a kid. It's part of a cosmology, actually. A sense of, I wasn't just born tabula rasa as a blank slate. Boom, poof. Here I am. I'm going to take the world on. No, I'm part of a lineage, and they have stories about what it was like to be in the world. And of course, you're reading experience itself. That's part of a cosmology. You're reading your own experience. What is it like to be me in the world? What is it like to be us in the world? What is it like to be our species in the world? You have to read that and study it. Because your experience is actually a bit tricky. And I don't want to get into my other favorite subject, which is Jung. But as you know, what we call experience, a lot of that is what we think in our egos is our experience. And of course, we have a whole underground labyrinth that rounds out our experience as human beings. Our intuition, our imagination, our feelings, our sensing, and our thinking brains. But everything beneath the surface matters too. So experience, even, what is my experience in the world, is a little more complicated now in the 21st century, which is part of the invitation of a new cosmology. So I thought I'd throw in a few of the creation narratives, because this was one way ancient people tried to make sense of life. They weren't exactly doing what Neil deGrasse Tyson is doing, which is trying to say what happened. That's the job of science, in my kind of simple way of putting it. What happened? Or another way of putting it is, what is happening? The ancient creation narratives weren't really doing that. It wasn't science. Why? Because science didn't exist. Wasn't that level of or that type of consciousness had yet to come into the world. So even in Genesis, the sort of Christian Hebrew, we always forget, people say that's the Christian narrative. It actually was the Hebrew narrative before the Christians said, we'll take that. Um, but even with the 7 days of creation, they weren't doing what a contemporary scientist would do with facts. They didn't have that quite that same framework. So anyway, I thought I'd take some of these creation narratives just so you could hear the different ways in which people imagined the origin of the world. Why were they imagining it? Because it related to their cosmology, which related to how do we live a meaningful life. And all the good stuff is in the, the creation narratives, like birth and death and nature, and how do we relate to nature, and why do I feel shame, and do human beings have moral autonomy? Can they hurt and love other human beings? Those are all part of all creation narratives. Trying to engage the question of what does it mean to live a meaningful life. And so I thought I did a little sampling, and I did a little comparative religion. I'm putting my graduate work into good use right now, so I can at least say it was worth the debt I went into. And one of the things I learned when I started comparative religion, I love my professor. He would say, I went to school in Israel, and he said, the problem in the United States with comparative religion, they always like to pick on the States and sometimes Europe. They said one of the big drives in comparative religion is how are we all saying the same thing? And he said, but here in this program, we're going to begin with how are we not saying the same thing? And because everybody as an academic, you have to be kind of a bully. But I liked it because it helped us ease into, actually, no, Judaism and Christianity aren't saying quite the same thing. And Islam is saying something slightly different. And then what about the Eastern religions? And you need difference as much as you need overlap. It's that dance is what becomes interesting. So I'm going to give you a little sample, and I'm interpreting these stories. But I want to talk about Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam. I thought I'd throw in the Mormons and some Gnosticism. I want to give you some ideas about how they talked about creation so that you can, on the one hand, hear the differences, and maybe you'll hear some overlaps too. So in Buddhism, and again, in the back of your mind, start thinking about, what about a new cosmology? I mean, unless you're like the Einstein of among us, which he or she might be here, I hope so. It's not like at the end of this talk, you'll be like, I've got the new cosmology, see me next week, we'll write it down. It doesn't work. I just mean as a question. What is in these ancient stories that might inform our way of looking at the world? So anyway, Buddhism, what's interesting is that in their creation stories, first of all, everything is eternal. All things are eternal, and there's no creator. Now that's a big difference, obviously, than a story where there's a creator. So there's a major difference. There's deep within Buddhist cosmology or creation narratives would be a sense of impermanence. That's one of the tenets of Buddhism. Everything is impermanent. Everything is impermanent. So even impermanence in terms of the cycles of things. What else can we say about Buddhism? Everything's in flux, and everything is a turning over of the birth-rebirth cycle. Okay? That's why there's no creator. If you say, when did it all begin? It doesn't matter. Who started it? Who cares? It's just, here it goes. Birth, rebirth. And actually, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to anyway. When you start getting into contemporary physics, which I'm no expert on, believe me, and those of you who probably are, like, I can tell you're not an expert in it. But even some contemporary theories about the Big Bang, it was collapse and kind of like swinging a bat and it hitting a ball. This may not work at all as a symbol, but that the universe somehow collapsed into something. That was what was before the Big Bang, and it started again, which sounds a bit like birth, rebirth. So maybe the universe, this kind of expansion, growth thing was happening, which was in the Buddhist creation story, which we heard from a moment ago. So in the Hindu tradition is similar in the sense of it's cyclical. that creation is a series of cycles, and sometimes eras or gods and goddesses, and sometimes the wars between them turn the cycles over. Um, their big symbol is creation and destruction. Buddhism is birth and rebirth. Theirs is creation, destruction. So if you read the Hindu stories of creation, the world gets destroyed, and in the ashes or something like that, it comes back out again. The thing with the Hindu creation narratives is that there's almost no uniformity about if there was a God involved or not involved. They seem to just say yes to everything. Oh, of course there were gods. Of course there weren't any gods that were involved. You're like, wait a minute, that doesn't work. But that's just the nature of Hinduism is like that. It's much more expansive around is there a creator or no creator? Is there a God or were multiple gods involved in the creation of the world? So in Christianity, which you're probably a little more familiar with, that's when you have the notion of ex nihilo, which is Latin, I think, but out of nothing. Which if you're a sort of biblical literalist, and that really is in quotation marks because that's an oxymoron, but anyway, it's like poof, out of nothing 6,000 years ago, the earth was created with age, and dinosaur bones were put in there by God just to kind of mess with us a little bit. Just to keep us on our toes, Silly. Anyway, that's the reason why I want to bring up ex nihilo is because if you just think about it, if you think about how that might operate in one's consciousness, you wonder why Western Christianity has such a high view of progress that it can make something out of nothing. You wonder where that comes from. It's rooted in creation narratives, in the cosmology in which creation narratives, how they influence. What else can we say about Christianity? It has also a kind of end to it, which is a lot different than Buddhism, with a new heaven and new earth. Again, you could see that as a symbol, but if you think about it as more of a literal form, as some Christians may, they think what is present here on the earth is going to die, and God's going to give us a new one, a better one, a cleaned up version at the end. And how might that have influenced what we think of as the Western world? Is sort of an interesting thing to conjure up. What else Christianity have in it? It has the concept of the upper world and the underworld. That's in the creation narrative, upper world and underworld, which in some sense is what influences people's notions of heaven and hell. Even when people say, I looked up to the heavens, where'd that come from? It came from a cosmology rooted in a creation narrative. Interestingly enough, Christianity, I know when I say Christianity, I'm talking about Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. But the creator, there are really two gods in the creation narrative if you look really carefully, but they create by word, which is very interesting. You wonder why people say, I swear on the Bible. Words become really important. Lay your hand on a book. I mean, what does that even mean anyway? Like, I swear to tell the truth. I'm putting my hand on these words. What is that about? Well, in some senses, it's rooted in a God that creates by word. So words must be really important. Anyway, I'm just giving you my interpretation of things. Okay, let's switch to Islam. Islam is not it's a much more similar to Judaism and Christianity in that there is a creator, that God created everything. Islam also has the notion of a new order is coming, not so much a new heaven and a new earth like Christianity, but a new order where things will be put back in its right place. And the Quran is what lifts us out of the prison of creation. Creation has its own trappings, but if I stick to the Quran, I can live kind of out of the prison of materialism and destruction and stay on the right path until, in the end, there'll be some sort of new order. So you can hear that it's kind of in conversation. Of course, Islam is 700 years after Christianity, and Christianity is, 1,000 years after, maybe 700 years after the creation narratives were penned by whoever wrote them. So they're in dialogue with one another. So the Mormons, I thought, they have some really interesting ideas about creation. It's not ex nihilo, by the way. They break with Christianity. They say, oh, it's not out of nothing. That something was there. And, um, and this is one of many inhabited worlds and planets. Now think about how that might change what it means to be a human. That this is one world of many inhabited planets. It's a little less egocentric. Wouldn't you agree? There are other planets out there with, and even God lives on a planet in Mormon cosmology, or I guess that would be more of theology. Anyway, that's about all I know about Mormons at present. So let's talk about Gnosticism. So Gnosticism is actually started as a Greek philosophical schools, you would say plural. And then there's something called Christian Gnosticism. We don't need to get into the weeds with all that stuff. But Gnosticism had two orders, the order of light and the order of darkness. The order of light was the higher order, and the order of darkness was the lower order, and they're separate. So there's lots of tension between light and dark, between good and evil, and actually, Gnosticism posited two creators. One creator that created spirit and light, and basically everything good, and kind of like a trickster evil, like I'm going to mess with the world, and I'm going to create material things. Things of the earth, the body, and that's somehow of the lower order. So Gnosticism really fed the stream of Christianity in that it started to separate out the material world from the spiritual world, which you don't have in most ancient religions, but Gnosticism sort of drove a wedge between the material and the spiritual stuff. And the material world is problematic. They also say something interesting, which they say, yes, although the material world is problematic, there are divine sparks of the higher order in all things, which is in the Kabbalah, by the way, in Judaism. It's even in George Bush's, senior 1,000 Points of Light. I'm serious. It's rooted in this. Although things are broken, there's sparks of the divine sort of scattered throughout. I enjoy this. So you're looking at me like, what is this guy talking about? So, okay, here are some just observations about this drive-through. This is like the McDonald's drive-through of creation narratives. But here are some major themes and differences. Some sort of outlooks have the out of nothing. That's number one. Number two, have just the eternal cycle, that all things just are. It's just round and round and round it goes. And the third possibility in these creation narratives are that creation somehow works with something into something new. And that's slightly different than just around the cycle we go. Those are kind of hidden behind these narratives. And I think it's important just to make this observation or a question, is there truth in any of these? I love when Ken Wilber says, not all worldviews are totally wrong. Not all worldviews are totally wrong. And within these creation narratives, although we're not sitting around the campfire talking about Tiamat and Babylonian whatever, there's still sort of something in there that we might want to say, is there any truth to that? And by the way, think about the major contemporary questions of science. They're talking about, was there anything before the Big Bang? Is it an ex nihilo situation? Did the universe have some material to work with or not? Or is it a cycle of universes expanding and shrinking and expanding and shrinking? Is that the case? Or was there some universe and out of that something new got generated? Do you hear that all three of those questions that science are asking are rooted right in the narratives of the major creation stories? It tells you that religion has an intuition about the way things are that is not totally out of line with scientific intuition and exploration. So instead of right now, the big invitation of the 21st century, by the way, with science and religion, is to get out of this divide. Saying one tells the truth and the other is a bunch of crap. Meaning, and that can go either way, depending on what sort of camp you're in. This is kind of nonsense on one level. It's kind of nonsense. Part of a cosmology is a study of the world, and we're studying it together. We need Neil deGrasse Tyson is like a saint right now in my cosmology. So is Einstein. Let's get a little halo and put him up on the wall. Um, as a contributor to understanding the world. And the big question beneath that is, what does it mean? You know, that's where science starts to back off. They're like, hey, we're just saying this what happened. We don't know what it means. So they need partners in the conversation about meaning. What else do I want to say? Here are just some observations. A modern cosmology, I think, my opinion of Ken Dobson, which you can dismiss. Um, I think a modern cosmology must include creation stories, plural. I think about ancient ones. I like ancient ones. But also the creation stories, period, that are emerging on the leading edge of these scientific fields. They are doing a kind of creation story. Check out Brian Swim's book, The Universe Story, if you want a poetic / scientific dance that's inviting into this kind of, to view even evolution as a sacred story for the first time instead of the enemy. So, and also the work of Thomas Berry. So, modern cosmology must include creation stories, science, nature, this human mind body study, like matter, brain. Like, what's that guy? I love the podcast, The Hidden Brain. You ever listen to that dude? I mean, this is like the cutting edge of what is material, what is mind, what's going on, and what's morality, and what are ethics, and why do people do what they do? What's the relationship between that and chemicals in the brain? All this kind of, that's part of the cosmology that we're being invited into. Um, the mysteries of space-time, of course, and the weirdness of space-time. I mean, we're talking about, you want to freak people out, forget about Genesis. Just read about black holes, you know? People are like, God is such a mystery, or, I don't know what to make about this. Try just reading the facts. Time is not fixed. No part of your conscious ego mind wants to accept that. That there's some relativity involved, unless you're just really creepy and you love that kind of stuff. So again, and it's a dance between what is largely the task of science, and what is meaningful. It's this conversation that has to go back and forth, in my view. Yeah, what else? So back to Diane DePrima's line. You cannot write a single line without a cosmology. Can you hear that now differently? Why? Because when you go about to write something, you're trying to say something that's true and something that's meaningful. You can't write a line without cosmology. Then it's just a random assortment of letters, like how some people are imagining the universe. It's just bumping into particles without any kind of meaning. But if you want to say anything at all, you need a cosmology. And so a short way of saying it is, you have one whether you like it or not. The question is, how carefully are you going to look at it? Because cosmology means study of the world, it's not fixed. That's the problem with any kind of fundamentalism, of course. It's fixed, No, this is the way it is. Don't challenge it. The people that are most open to change right now, I'm making a very general statement, are scientists, not religious people. They're the ones that are much more comfortable with ambiguity, with mystery, and with not knowing than religious fundamentalists, who supposedly have texts that talk about mystery. They're like, we don't want to read those. By the way, here's a little image for you. I got this from Neil deGrasse Tyson. He says, imagine what we know as a sphere. Imagine what we know as a sphere, like a globe. There it is. That's what we know. Now, what's at the edge of the sphere? What we don't know. Correct? And actually, science is interested in the edge between what we know and what we don't know. Would you agree with that? Okay. Then he says, as knowledge grows, the sphere grows. Make sense? And it grows a little more. It grows a little more, it grows a little more. But what's interesting about that as an image is as that thing grows, guess what also grows? What we don't know. The edge of the sphere gets bigger. Now you can hear Rilke saying, I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. Widening circles. Not more and more narrow, narrow, narrow down the drain, but I live my life in widening circles. So I love that image. And scientists, believe it or not, are comfortable with this. They're comfortable with not knowing. And you know who used to be comfortable with not knowing? What we called monks, spiritual people, the Buddha, Jesus. They went around telling people, if you start to go toward God mystery, you go toward the unknown. So they're not speaking totally different languages, spirituality and science. So, and by the way, if you think about that, instead of such a fixed universe, growing up looks like increased levels of ambiguity and not knowing, which might contribute to a more humble way of being on the earth. And what do we know? We actually know for a scientific fact, we need human beings to begin a much more humble way of being on the earth. Because one that's fixed, we know what we're doing. All this stuff is material for me to cut down and use and destroy to my own tastes, is destroying everything. All right. So we have a cosmology whether we like it or not. I thought about Isaiah as I was preparing this. Isaiah has this great line. He says, I looked up to the stars and said, who created all these? Do you feel the wonder with such a thing? I think now, my opinion, is in the 21st century, we need more of that. I looked up at the stars and I wondered who created all these. Now, I don't necessarily mean we need people thinking about, is there a creator, is there not? Just lay down in the lawn what Isaiah knew nothing about, meaning how big is space? How far away is the Oort cloud? Do you even know what the Oort cloud is? It's the very edge of our solar system. All right? I don't remember how far away it is, but he didn't know anything about the Oort cloud. So when he looked up at the stars and wondered who created all these, yes, that was an experience of wonder. What I'm saying is that we have the capacity for even greater wonderings. What is this place really? What is dark matter? What is the speed of light? By the way, what's our solar system? Anybody know? What's it called? What's our galaxy? Sorry, that's where I was going. What's our galaxy called? The Milky Way. And how many galaxies are there? Anybody know? Yeah, there are now they say there are billions. And if you shrink them down to the size of a pea, the galaxy called the Milky Way, let's shrink it down to the size of a pea. It's a very small pea. Can you imagine it? That's our galaxy, not our solar system, but our galaxy. And then now what we think we know, we could fill like the University of Michigan stadium with peas. That's what we're talking about. So I laid down, and I wondered who created all these. See? That's a kind of spirituality that's related to science. Facts. Anyway, I'm getting kind of excited. I need to finish my talk here. So, we need creation stories. We need creation stories because they help us form a cosmology in two specific ways. They are trying to answer, how did we get here? That's true. They're trying to answer, how do we get here? And now we're a little more interested that because of the post-Enlightenment scientific mind, we mean it in a more literal sense than they did in the ancient world. But how do we get here? How did you get here? And by the way, that's complicated because you have particles in your body that existed before you did. What is that? What is that? Who can explain such a thing? So we need creation stories to help us just contact the mystery of our own being in terms of how do we get here. And we need stories, we need myths, we need science, we need it all to help with such a thing. And my other suggestion is we need science as a new kind of sacred story, which is what I've been sort of hinting around about. We need science as a new kind of sacred story. It's nothing to fear. I mean, think about the Trump administration. They're afraid of the truth, which is a kind of metaphor for our time. I mean, and everybody, to a certain extent, on one level is afraid of the truth because the way I've put things, I bump to the edge of, like the sphere. Correct? And if I admit this, my sphere is going to grow, and I'm not going to know who I am anymore. That sums up the Trump administration, a tiny sphere, and it doesn't want to expand at all. But anyway, science, I don't know why I pick on the Trump administration in every talk, but I pretty much do. It's easy, it's too easy, yeah. Yeah. But that's my suggestion, that it's a new kind of sacred story. And to even engage with that kind of information, it becomes a kind of sacred dance. And behind all this, again, and I'm not here to give you the answers, I think we have to keep coming back around to, and what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? Because what does it mean to be human? How do we live a meaningful life? What is truth? What is goodness? What is beauty? What is love? To keep coming around about to these things. Otherwise, we end up with just a material universe that is without meaning. A series of particles that bump in together randomly. And that, I'm telling you, leads to really a low-level depression. I mean, what's the point? If it's just random particles, why care about social justice? Those are just other particles bumping together for a while. Who cares? See, nobody likes that, right? Well, maybe some people do. They're like, good, I don't have to do anything. But that's why I'm talking about a conversation with meaning. All right, I actually want to anticipate what. Can I borrow your final reading? Because I want to end with some Neil deGrasse Tyson, because number one, I don't understand it. And we'll all say it together in a minute, but it's just so lovely and strange. I kind of wanted to end my talk with these words, if it's on here. Here it is. During the Hadron era, you remember that, it was actually, the Hadron era, I think, was 1/1000th of a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second after the Big Bang. You remember. Ambient photons, light, could no longer invoke E equals mc squared. Because you know how you get to that point in life when you can no longer evoke E equals mc squared to manufacture quark-antiquark pairs. It happens. For every billion annihilations, leaving a billion photons in their wake, a single hadron survived. Those loners would ultimately get to have all the fun. Because they served as the source of galaxies, stars, planets, and people. That's my talk.